Hi, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lori, and I'm the marketing manager here at Hyperproof, and I'll be getting us started. In today's webinar, we will be unveiling Hyperproof's GRC maturity model. Kane McGladrey, Hyperproof's field CISO, crafted the extensive guide using over 30 years of experience in GRC. We'll discover how this model represents a pivotal advancement in the GRC landscape and get insights that will empower your organization's governance, risk, and compliance strategies. During this session, we will provide a foundational understanding of the GRC maturity model and explore its parts. A bit of housekeeping points before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we welcome you to enter them into the Q&A box for our speaker to answer after the presentation. If you have any problems with audio or visual during the event, please try leaving the presentation and re-entering. If this doesn't work, please let us know you are having trouble in the Q&A box. The event is being recorded and will be available on demand on our Bright Talk channel after the event ends. And lastly, attendees will receive an email with a link to the on-demand event as well as their own copy of the GRC maturity model. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kane McGladrey, Hyperproof's field CISO. Take it away, Kane.
Thanks, Lori. So, as she said, I'm Kane, Field CISO. I'm also a senior member of the IEEE, and I sit on a couple educational advisory boards. A little background, I'm a former CISO from an A&D company, that's aerospace and defense, and I've done executive advisory work on about 3 continents now. You also might know me from my LinkedIn, where I often write about regulatory changes and litigation, although I should disclose I am not an attorney, even though people often think I sound like one. So today's the first in a 3-part series about the GRC maturity model. Today, I want to cover about what it is and give a high-level overview of the model. Something I'll say at the outset, this is going to be very high-level, as the model is over 100 pages. So if you have a question that I can't answer during this brief presentation, it's probably already in the first version of the model. And as Lori said, please hold your questions to the end because we do have quite a lot to get through. I'll also say that even though I'm the author of this maturity model, I wouldn't be here without my peers. CISOs, security leaders, and other executive advisors read and commented on the model. And in our second webinar, you'll meet 4 of them. I wouldn't be here also without the patience of Hyperproof's design team, who weren't really expecting me to drop 180 very dry pages of text on their desks in the hopes that they might make it look better. And finally, I wouldn't be here without the help of the marketing team who worked with me to make these slides readable and accessible, so I'm not saying, hey, sorry for the eye chart, everyone, because we do have a lot of content to get through. But before we get there, let's talk about why you came to this presentation today. My main guess for why you're here is that you're a GRC professional who wants to learn how to improve your company's GRC capabilities. Now, you might also be someone who's a recipient or a beneficiary of those GRC processes as well. And the reason you're here is you're interested in learning about the GRC maturity model and how it can benefit you and your organization. For example, if you're a CISO like me, you're probably interested in how the model might reduce the probability of civil litigation due to poor disclosures stemming from immature GRC processes at your organization. So today we're going to start our conversation by talking about what the model is, just some level setting, and then we'll get into the high-level processes associated with each of governance, risk, and compliance. So other than the product of way too much coffee and about 4 or 6 months of writing and another 3 months of peer review, what is this we're talking about? First up, here are the people who are really going to care about this model. Now, there are downstream benefits to the cybersecurity team, but I'll be the first to acknowledge this is primarily about business processes and executive sponsors, not directly cybersecurity. I say that because I have a cybersecurity background, and I've come to realize that the best path forward to improve cybersecurity is to support organizations in improving their GRC processes. And throughout today's presentation, you'll see why. So here's what a maturity model looks like. It's a vendor-neutral, self-scored journey for organizations to get better at doing something important. It's a roadmap or an atlas, but it's not prescriptive for how you to get to the next level. Instead, organizations exhibit characteristic behaviors associated with each level. If you're from a cybersecurity background, you might remember CISA's zero trust maturity model. And if you remember that, they didn't just say, hey, get better at zero trust. They had to define what zero trust was and then what attributes of good looked like at each of multiple maturity levels so that organizations could understand, here's how we get better. The GRC maturity model has that same underpinning philosophy. But when I started looking at this problem space in the second half of 2023, I started out with a question, which is why anybody hadn't made a maturity model for GRC. I was really surprised to find like there wasn't something out there like the CISO Zero Trust maturity model that was in common use, something that would be an easy Google search away. So the model is intended to fill that gap, to be a common way for companies to self-assess their maturity and make plans to improve it. And crucially, it's vendor agnostic. Let me tell you, this drove some really awkward conversations at first around Hyperproof. But I've seen vendor-specific maturity models in cybersecurity before. And inevitably, they're just a reason to buy more products, which mean those models just get ignored because they're entirely tools dependent. We don't have a tools problem in GRC. A good friend of mine described it this way. He could go buy some plywood and some 2x4s and a saw and some nails and a hammer, and he could put it all on the floor of his garage. Those tools are not going to make him a dinner table. He has to commit his own time and his own money to build that dinner table. But we've been approaching GRC collectively like we could just buy the right tools to solve it, as though GRC is some kind of simple problem that we're going to solve. And I've seen this in cybersecurity for decades, where the initial view from IT and from business was, this is just some project. You just buy some simple product and you're going to fix it. I don't think that GRC is a problem, and I know it's not simple. So if that's what it is, what isn't the model? First up, this isn't NIST 853 GRC edition. This is not a control framework. I love the team over at the Center for Internet Security, and this work does not overlap with the CIS-CSC. There aren't some control requirements like you'd see in a control framework. This is more vibes-based. It's a great approach, right? It's vibes-based. Second, this isn't going to require you go buy a product, because let's say somebody even made an AI smart enough to do some of the manual decision-making that's in the model. You'd still want to have a human in the loop to check your results. And this also isn't a certification or an attestation. If you know my love of cyber insurance market reports, there's not some GRC maturity sticker you're going to be able to show your insurance broker to get you a discount. Finally, this isn't a commercial for Hyperproof. There are processes in the model we don't sell a product for. Just a quick example, crisis communications. Anybody who's been through a recent disaster like that CrowdStrike drama just last month, you know you have to have a crisis communications plan in place. You need to be able to execute that plan, and when your comm system has failed, sometimes you need a backup plan. Hyperproof doesn't sell crisis communication solutions, even though that is a part of the model. I want to share one final set of thoughts before we get into it. I said earlier there's no published, widely adopted maturity model for governance, risk, and compliance. In my search for a GRC maturity model, I talked to over 100 CISOs and heads of GRC, and I've also been, like I said, I've done this for decades now, doing executive advisory and consulting to Fortune 500 and Global 1000 companies. Nobody mentioned the OCEG Red Book until I was finalizing the peer review phase. Let me tell you, that was awkward. I spent nearly 6 months writing this thing, only to find 2 months into a 3-month review cycle from one of my peer reviewers that OCEG wrote a Red Book. It's a very nice theoretical framework for improving GRC. But I've done board level work regularly, and boards, they don't have the time for more theory, which is why I think the OCEG Red Book really didn't take off, despite having contributions from a heck of a lot of smart people. I'm a practitioner. I've always been a practitioner, and I wanted something that a company could actually implement in a reasonable amount of time. Because something I've found with companies that, with a mature GRC program, they have an advantage over their competitors. And those advantages could be like entering new business markets, or maintaining their certifications more efficiently, or sometimes limiting the risk of additional regulatory oversight. But that advantage might have only come from hiring the right person at the right time, which is inevitably somebody who's done GRC at a lot of companies before. And to me, this has created a GRC poverty line. where companies that can't afford to hire the right people or the right management consultants, they're going to have a bad time against a world of accelerating regulatory and legal requirements. In the United States, I think we're going to see more state-level regulatory and legal changes in response to the Loper-Bright decision. But if you're doing business in the EU, they're not slowing down their pace of change. Companies can't just base scaling your GRC strategy on, hey, we'll just hire a better GRC person, or we're going to buy some magical tool that fixes GRC. Like I said, I've seen this in cybersecurity where we treated it as a problem to be solved for decades until people finally went and go, oh wait, this is a part of modern business. I don't think GRC is any different than that. So the model defines 4 levels of maturity, starting from traditional, then moving to initial, advanced, and optimal. Broadly speaking, traditional means reactive, with poor or no planning, while optimal means being proactive and using a lot of measurements. I decided to use 4 levels, not CMMI's 5, and that was a deliberate choice. I don't want GRC professionals to think about this like controls framework with evidentiary requirements, because then it's really easy for us to get into a cycle of analysis paralysis. This is meant to be something that's approachable and something that companies can start to use this year. Now, if I get a lot of community feedback that I should have used a different scale, I will be happy to say I was wrong and I'll fix it in the future. But I wasn't about to just say, let perfect be the enemy of what's good enough. But those 4 levels themselves, they're not good enough. Theirs are defined for each of governance, risk, and compliance. And then compliance operations provides a modern and stable foundation. Now, we all know what governance is, we know what risk is, and we know what compliance means. Compliance operations thematically is about process automation and optimization that allows cross-functional collaboration between each of those pillars of governance, risk, and compliance. And that allows organizations to align their strategic goals more closely with their operational and their tactical activities, which make sure that every part of the organization is working towards the same objectives with clear communication and consistent direction. And I can assure you, it's not going to require you to go buy some specific tool or technology to improve your maturity level. We're going to get each one of these at a high level for the rest of the presentation. So according to the model, governance is a set of 6 processes: board oversight and direction, ethical and sustainable practices, financial oversight and management, information and technology governance, mission, vision, and values, and policies and procedures. And every one of those processes can be at a different maturity level, from traditional to optimal. And we're going to see a lot of these slides. For each of the 4 maturity levels from left to right, I've picked some high-level attributes of how an organization at that maturity level behaves. And this is a subset, what you're seeing on screen. The full model has a list of characteristics, but my design team couldn't fit all of them on the slides. But the slides are all going to follow this general layout today. The point of board oversight and direction is to make sure you have strategic alignment, risk management, and compliance, which really helps organizational resilience and to build stakeholder confidence. Effective board oversight includes a regular review of your policies, as well as risk management, and making sure you have the financial integrity to align with your strategic objectives. So if we look at each of our 4 levels, traditional on the left is often pretty sporadic. There's a focus on short-term issues and minimal compliance monitoring, and there's not really a formal governance framework in place. The initial level introduces regular meetings and emerging risk oversight and some basic compliance monitoring, which sets the foundation for structured governance. At the advanced level, governance structures are well-defined, and there's active strategic planning, comprehensive risk management, and advanced compliance systems. Finally, that optimal level, that signifies continuous governance improvement, strategic foresight, data-driven decisions, and a really robust focus on accountability and skills development. And I'll mention also, I just saw a chat question come in there. If you do have questions in the chat, please do drop those in the chat, and I'll be taking them at the end. So turning to ethical and sustainable practices. In corporations, that ranges from traditional, pretty minimal efforts to optimal, fully integrated strategies that enhance long-term success, as well as societal well-being. So ethical and sustainable practices evolve from ad hoc, like I said, pretty minimal efforts. Then you see fully integrated strategies that go across the organization. And looking at our 4 levels, at traditional, there's a lack of a structured ethical and sustainability framework. And really the focus is on short-term gains with really minimal stakeholder engagement. Initial level companies, they start to establish basic ethical and sustainability frameworks, but they have limited integration and stakeholder engagement. Advanced organizations, that's where we start to see comprehensive, strategically aligned ethical and sustainability practices that have got proactive compliance and robust stakeholder engagement. And finally, when you get to an optimal level entity, they deeply embed ethical and sustainable practices into their company culture, and they focus on long-term societal impact and continuous innovation. Turning to financial oversight and management, that moves from ad hoc reactive practices to sophisticated strategic processes that really enhance organizational stability and compliance. Now, initially, financial management is often unstructured, and there's limited budgeting and forecasting and reactive decision making, and there's a lack of comprehensive oversight and controls. It's funny, I've worked at startups. I've advised startups. I've advised mid-sized companies. I've been with companies that have been in their first seed round. And even though there's these things called generally accepted accounting procedures, you'd be surprised at how those aren't actually like consistently run, or how budgeting at early stage companies can just be a hot mess. But as organizations develop into that initial phase, they start to standardize their financial processes. They start to integrate their planning with their strategic objectives, and they start to improve their reporting, their decision making, and their risk management. Once we get up to advanced levels, organizations use quantitative metrics. They build out comprehensive internal controls and sophisticated cash flow management techniques, which aligns with their strategic goals. Publicly traded companies, they're often at this level due to things like Sarbanes-Oxley or New York Department of Financial Services Section 500 and other requirements, because investors expect they can make informed decisions about their investments in publicly traded companies, right? So this is just once you get to that advanced level, you've got that stakeholder confidence in the public markets. Finally, when we get into that optimal level, financial management is really defined by continuous improvement, advanced strategic planning, and then the integration of technology, which really fostered a culture of learning and innovation in these companies. Now, in my experience, information and technology governance, that usually starts out pretty ad hoc, but eventually it progresses to be aligned with the business and aligned with risk management and then efficiency. And across all of these levels, the theme is that there's a less dependence on the individual, on individual knowledge, on the right person knowing the right answer at the right time, like that one person who works in the help desk who you can always go to when you've got a question. We move away from that as organizations grow. But also IT is not just seen as a cost center. I think in early stage companies, IT is just a cost center. It's a black hole that's kind of a necessary thing for a modern company, but ultimately it's not seen as a strategic capability. And when we look at that traditional level of IT governance, usually if you get somebody who's done this before, they start to build out a basic framework of IT governance and trying to align their IT with their business goals. But the processes are still pretty unstructured and they're pretty reactive. Now, when you start to improve on this, the first thing you have to do is start to build out standardized processes. But also I see that IT, more than a lot of, I think with the exception of financial management, IT really leans into quantitative metrics. And that includes things like IT spend and IT risk management, as well as strategic resource management, which moves IT from a support role to becoming a strategic business partner. And it's funny to me that the integration of quantitative metrics shows up here at the initial level, because this is the first time that IT is seen as a strategic advantage, not just some cost center. And that initial focus on reducing or controlling IT spend tends to drive that earlier investment into metrics. When we get into the advanced levels, those are characterized by comprehensive governance and active stakeholder engagement, and then robust security controls to mitigate the risks associated with threat actors. And at the optimal level, IT governance is ultimately adaptive and predictive, and it's fully integrated with the business strategy. And there's that emphasis again on continuous improvement and innovation. And moving to our the other thing I want to say on this, really, I put in this slide at the end. At the advanced level and at the optimal level, IT is seen as a business enabler. It's not just a cost center. And being able to report on IT governance can help other processes we'll talk about, like maintaining external attestations and certifications. If you have to get something like a SOC 2, or if you have to get an ISO, or if you want to have any other certifications that show your company is trustworthy. Moving to mission, vision, and values, which is also MVV, if you want your acronym of the day. The purpose of it is to give a foundational framework which guides your organizational goals, your ethics, and your strategic alignment. Now, creating and maintaining the organization's mission, vision, and values, that really involves stakeholder engagement. And it involves an analysis, a thoughtful analysis of the organization's current and future state. And more often than not, I've seen nobody gets this right out of the gate. Like, it's always an iterative process of drafting, because what you're trying to do is align the company's business objectives with ethical standards and values that people can get behind. But at the traditional level, organizations often they lack a mission and a vision, and they've got some wildly inconsistent application of their values with what they actually do. And you see fragmented culture due to minimal strategic alignment and leadership involvement. When we get to that initial level, organizations have started to define their mission and vision, and they start to improve strategic alignment and employee engagement. But again, there's those inconsistencies in the values application as well as the culture development of the business. Advanced level organizations, they have a well-integrated mission, vision, and values, and they've built those into their strategic planning. But there's also there's strong leadership involvement, and there's also strong employee engagement. And they also have aligned their performance measurement and their risk management with their core principles. I've been at companies where they've, we have a set of, I don't know how many principles it might be 5, might be 10. I don't think I've ever seen more than 10. And that comes up in performance reviews of how people demonstrated their commitment to a principle. And that really helps shape the narrative. When we get to the optimal level organizations, they're continuously refining their principles to adapt to whatever conditions the market might be in. And those are deeply integrated into all the aspects of the company's business, which really make sure that they are aligned with their ethical standards, their stakeholder engagement, and kind of a positive global impact. I can think of one company I was at years ago when Lehman Brothers kicked off. And for those of you who don't remember what Lehman Brothers was, it was basically the global economy melted down one day. It sucked. And a whole bunch of companies had to decide, what are we going to do about the fact that nobody wants to buy our stuff anymore, because the mortgage industry basically collapsed and took most of the economy with it for a period of time. And some companies said, you know what, we are going to just do layoffs. And the company that I was at, we looked at it and said, we could, but instead, why don't we just all take a pay cut? And the pay cut was based on whether or not you were like a line staff, or whether or not you were, a first level manager, or whether you were an executive, or whether you were a senior executive. And as it went up, we said, you know what, we really prioritize the doers in this company. That's part of our values. So the way we demonstrated those values was to say, you know what, people at the executive level, I think our CEO took a 70% pay cut. I know that like our senior executives took 50% pay cuts just so we could get it through, so that we did not have to let go of anybody, because we knew that we'd come through as a more resilient organization. That's an example of, I want to say we were advanced. I don't think we were quite optimal because we didn't have that global lens, but that's an example of the type of behaviors you see at organizations like this. And it runs, often these run counter to the larger media narrative that you see. And then finally, let's talk about policies and procedures, because this is also as part of governance. And organizations they move through these from that traditional level to that optimal level. And often you start out pretty ad hoc, and eventually you end up with data-driven policies. But every level from traditional to optimal, it shows a logical progression in documentation and standardization, as well as integration of policies that improve your organizational governance, risk management, and compliance. But at the traditional level, organizations normally lack documented policies, or they haven't been formally documented, or they haven't been formally signed off on, or maybe somebody's written a document and they've posted it to the SharePoint and they hope somebody might read it. And what that means is you've got pretty inconsistent practices and decision making, and it's kind of like early stage IT governance. It's reliant on individual knowledge. The initial level, that introduces some documentation and some basic enforcement of policies and procedures. And often that's at the project level. It's not always at the organizational level or at the enterprise level, but usually at a project level, you can get pretty consistent behavior. And that's where we start to see some defined and well understood rules. Advanced organizations, they've got standardized policies across all of their areas, and they have proactive views on risk management. And they also have data-driven policy development that's aligned with their strategic objectives. Now, when I say data-driven, I mean that they can look at external market forces and say, we need to adapt our policy to this new issue or this new risk or this new challenge. Sometimes they will look internally and say, well, this policy, we can't enforce it because it's poorly written, or it's a paper tiger. You see a lot of that where organizations, especially young CISOs, write policies that just don't exist based on any existing controls. And as we move out of that advanced and into that optimal, that's where we start really continuously refining our policies, not just on an annual cycle, but sometimes more frequently based on data and feedback. And that feedback can come from employees, that feedback can come from HR, that feedback can come from the market or from suppliers or vendors. And what we start to do is we integrate our policies with our business processes, and we start using predictive analytics to enhance our governance so we can make better decisions long-term about policy decisions. So how's governance? Like I said, that's the high level. There's a lot more in the model, including how to move from one level to the next level across each one of those. Now, turning to risk, and many of us on this webinar probably know risk pretty well if you come from a cybersecurity background. Risk, according to the model, is a set of 6 distinct processes, and I'd say all of them work very closely together. As I mentioned at the top, there's crisis management and response planning. There's also integrating risk with strategy and decision making. And then for those of you who are a risk professional, there are 4 processes that work as a cycle: risk assessment and analysis, risk prioritization, risk mitigation planning, and risk monitoring and reporting. Again, every one of those processes can be at a different maturity level from traditional to optimal. And in case you're thinking it right now, like, yeah, this probably sounds like a risk management framework, like the ISO 1 or the NIST one. It's not. And I won't say which risk management framework is best. I'll say the one that's probably best is the one that you're currently using. And as such, the GRC maturity model doesn't have things you'd find like control requirements or definitions. Rather, this is about what an organization does, which means you can use this alongside any risk management framework that you're already familiar with and that your organization is already using. So, crisis management and response planning. It starts out as a basic activity, and it tends to be pretty reactive. But as it moves along, it becomes advanced, and then you get proactive systems that really enhance organizational resilience. But they help to build stakeholder confidence, and in publicly traded companies, it helps with shareholder confidence. So effective crisis management, it doesn't just minimize the impact of crises, but it also helps to build confidence among our organization's stakeholders and our organization's employees. And in some cases, like it can reduce the risk of government oversight if your organization is having an emergency. If you want a really good example of why this is in the model, go ahead and Google Tony Hayward. Just go ahead and look him up, or maybe you have to type in Tony Hayward and Deepwater Horizon. Don't be like Tony. That's going to be the lesson here. Or alternatively, think of CrowdStrike just recently. They said, you know what? We're so sorry for your little IT problem that you had there. We'll buy you a $10 cup of coffee through Uber Eats. I don't know if you can actually, where I'm at, get an Uber Eats cup of coffee for $10, but that was part of their disastrous response where they were offering people $10 gift cards for, in the case of some airlines, like causing $500 million worth of damage. That we're going to get into that in a minute more, but just looking at, basic levels, those traditional levels of crisis management, those are pretty ad hoc and they're reactive, and there's not a lot of planning put into it. And what that means is you get inefficient crisis handling, and you get a high reliance on having the right person, having the key individual, having the best spokesperson. And any organization that's been through a tabletop exercise associated with a cybersecurity data breach or a ransomware incident, you start to realize very quickly, and if you're breach coach or your tabletop runner, the person who's facilitated, I should say, didn't tell you about this, they did you a disservice, because you have to have a way of communicating to people. This is what we're doing as a business in response to this data breach or this data incident or this ransomware or whatever bad thing happened. Now, at the initial level, you start to get towards formalized crisis management, and that involves like having a basic plan and a basic strategy. But often it's still not comprehensive, and it's not been aligned with a risk assessment, and it's not necessarily been brought to your stakeholders. As we move to advanced crisis management, that encompasses systematic risk assessments, but also you start seeing regular training, because one of those things you find if you've been through enough data breaches or enough incidents is that people will do as they've been trained, and if you've simulated this often enough, it becomes a natural motion. And yet often in cybersecurity, we historically have not been very good at that, of training people like, here's how to manage a crisis. So I'd say that comes up in that advanced level. You also get integrated teams, so we don't have data silos or we don't have information silos. And then finally, we get sophisticated communications protocols for effective crisis response, because not all crises need to be communicated in the same way, and not sometimes, like internal comms channels, you have to choose very, very intentionally how you're going to talk about the crisis so that you can limit who knows information about that crisis. And then moving to the optimal level of crisis management, that involves continuous improvement and adaptive strategies, but also advanced predictive analytics. So you can predict, like if you know there is a hurricane coming, or if you know that there's a high risk of wildfires or something like that, that your organization can be ready in place with a crisis plan and a crisis communications plan and a response plan in advance, which is going to really ensure your organizational preparedness, but also to help build resilience. Now, in case you were Googling it, I name dropped Tony Hayward there. And in case you haven't heard his story, somebody at BP, that's British Petroleum, thought it would be a great idea to put him in front of his super yacht, complaining about how he'd like his life back. And he was in front of a Gulf fishing community that was effectively, it was directly affected, and their livelihoods were destroyed by his company's disaster. And I raise this because crisis management and response planning is just as applicable to a resource-based industry like BP as it is to a company like CrowdStrike or like Delta. Companies need to have plans on how to manage their IT outages, their natural disasters, and their data breaches. Now let's talk about integrating risk with strategy. That really helps organizational and board level decision making, because we start to align our risk management with our objectives to improve our organizational resilience and efficiency. So effective risk integration into strategy and decision making, really it promotes a forward thinking, a proactive approach to managing potential adverse impacts that are aligned with our organizational goals and our behaviors. But at the traditional level, you see inconsistent risk integration, and it's entirely reliant on individual judgment and reactive decision making. And that leads to fragmented risk information and limited at best alignment with the company's strategic objectives. When we move to the initial level, basic risk integration processes start to show up with some defined roles, which show kind of a mix of reactive and proactive approaches, but there's still a lack of consistency and depth of integration. At the advanced level, you start to see standardized processes. You start to see organization-wide alignment and advanced risk assessment tools and a strong culture of risk-aware decision-making. Growing companies often have to integrate their view of risk with their strategies as they move into the advanced level so that they can make informed decisions, but also so they can report those decisions out to market regulators if they're publicly traded as part of their 10K or their 10Q, or to their own boards if they're not. And at the optimal level, there's really a culture of continuous improvement in risk management. And there's the use of sophisticated predictive models, as well as real-time monitoring, so that we can dynamically adjust our strategies and enhance our data-driven decision-making associated with strategic risks. Now, our next four processes in the model, they're a logical cycle. And if you've seen a risk management framework before, this is going to look pretty familiar, right? We start with risk assessment. We move to prioritization, and then mitigation planning, and then reporting. And by measuring the maturity of each of these distinct processes, we can plan for improvements. For example, let's say your company is really good at risk prioritization. It's killing it. You're doing the best risk prioritization that's possible, but you're terrible at risk assessment. So in practical terms, that means your organization has a bunch of hidden risks that aren't coming up during your risk assessments, and so you can't prioritize them, and so you aren't really working with a full view of your risks. But it's human nature to want to get better at the things that we're already good at because that feels good, but it would make a lot more sense in that scenario to improve risk assessments because there would actually be a tangible benefit to the organization. So the next four slides, they're a simplified view on risk management frameworks based on the GRC maturity model. Something I've learned is there can be heated arguments about whether or not NIST's or ISO's risk management framework, and it doesn't matter. It genuinely doesn't. Sorry. What matters is the organizations have got a defined process and they follow it consistently. So arguing over which model is better just tends to avoid doing the work. The GRC maturity model is risk management framework agnostic. Just keep using whatever you're using and just think about evaluating the maturity of all of your risk processes using the information presented here. So our first step is risk assessment. And that moves from reactive basic measures to proactive integrated strategies that really enhance organizational resilience. But the evolution from traditional to optimal risk management underscores the shift from individual judgment and manual processes to a strategic view, to technology-driven frameworks, and you've got stakeholder engagement. At the initial level of risk assessment, there's sporadic reactionary responses, and there's minimal understanding and not really a comprehensive analysis of risks. Improving involves having structured risk identification and prioritization and the development of some basic risk management plans, though you might not have, it might still be a bit reactive at times. When we move to the advanced level, there's the markings of consistent comprehensive processes and their strategic alignment, and often there's the use of sophisticated analysis techniques for proactive risk mitigation planning. And at the optimal risk management level, we see predictive strategies, we see continuous improvement, and we see analytical tools that get built into the organizational fabric, which really do help with resilience, but they also help with adaptability as risks change. The second step after risk assessment is risk prioritization. And organizations, they can only really prioritize the risks that they know about. So if they're more mature at prioritizing risks, but less mature at assessing risks, an organization would say have a bunch of hidden risks that would be surprises when they became problems. And this is why I separated out risk assessment from prioritization, because the processes are interdependent. But in large organizations, they're distinct, and they have different owners, and they often have different entry and exit criteria. So risk prioritization helps organizations focus on their critical risks by assessing and categorizing, and then continuously monitoring their potential impacts and their likelihoods. At the traditional level, it's ad hoc, it's unstructured, and there's not really a framework. It's a lot of individual knowledge and a lot of individual experience, and you have to have hired the right person to do it, which I don't think scales. At the initial level, organizations start to have basic processes and documentation, but the application and the data analysis for decision making is still kind of limited. At the advanced level, there's standardized, proactive risk management that's aligned with organizational objectives, and that's supported by comprehensive risk training and advanced analytics. When we get to optimal risk management, that involves continuous improvement, integration of advanced predictive techniques, and also a strong organizational culture that's focused on risk intelligence and strategic alignment throughout the business. After you finish risk prioritization, you get into risk mitigation planning, which that's a systematic process to minimize risks, which helps ensure we've got business continuity, and we also enhance our organizational resilience. This is our third step because now we've got a list of agreed upon risks and they've been prioritized. So now it's time to actually develop strategies to reduce their likelihood or sometimes their severity. And this doesn't always mean applying controls to those risks. Some risks can be transferred to insurance or through contracts. And some risks, they're just too small to care about. And some risks are going to require mitigation. But if your organization is mature at assessment but less mature at prioritization, there's no guarantee that the effort and resources that you put into risk mitigation are going to actually produce a meaningful reduction in risks to the organization. At the traditional level, risk management is it's sporadic. It lacks formal plans, and again, there's that dependency on the individual, on individual knowledge, and that means you get inconsistent risk responses, and you get minimal stakeholder involvement. And sometimes you get people who just they care about one category of risk and they ignore all other risks, or they ignore as many of those other risks as possible, which is not a way that you have a successful business long term. At the initial level, that starts introducing some basic risk mitigation processes, but there's a focus on project level strategies. And there's some documentation, but it's still inconsistently applied, and there's limited training for people about risk mitigation planning. Advanced level organizations, this is where we start to see standards. We start to see data-driven risk mitigation processes across all departments, and there is comprehensive training, and there is stakeholder involvement, but there are also performance reviews of how well these risk mitigation plans are mitigating our risks. At the optimal level, there's a continuous improvement in risk mitigation. There's advanced predictive techniques and technology, and there's a risk culture, I'd say, that is aligned closely with an organization's goals. So the last step of the risk cycle, at least according to the GRC maturity model, is risk monitoring and reporting, which moves from basic reactive methods to sophisticated proactive processes that are aligned with the company's strategic goals. This is about reporting out on how everything worked together, because you identified the risks, you prioritized them, you applied mitigations, and now you need to tell your stakeholders how it's going. At the traditional level, risk monitoring and reporting is pretty inconsistent. It's reactive. Somebody asks you how it's going and you think, oh, maybe I should go look, right? And it's heavily reliant on manual methods to go measure the impact of risk mitigation. And there's also individual judgment at this point that's highly required. At the initial level, you get some basic structured processes and some technology use, but the approaches are still pretty reactive and they're often really projects or department specific. Advanced risk monitoring, that's where we start to see standardized data-driven processes across the organization with an emphasis on proactive monitoring as well as training for everyone. And optimal risk management, that integrates advanced predictive analytics and is aligned with the organization's strategy, which really helps to build a strong, adaptable risk culture. So that was a risk. That was risk, just at a high level. There's a lot more in the model. I'm not kidding when I say that, including specific characteristics for each process at each level so that you could do a self-assessment. So our final topic is, before we get on our second to final topic, I should say, is compliance, which is also made up of 6 distinct processes. Those are attaining and maintaining external attestations and certifications, compliance with contractual requirements, compliance with legal requirements, managing relationships with regulatory bodies, monitoring and auditing, and remediation of compliance issues. And again, every one of these processes can be at a different maturity level, scaling from traditional to optimal. So achieving attestations and certifications, that really helps with organizational credibility and operational efficiency. and compliance with industry standards, and it also tends to reduce business-to-business sales friction. This also means you need to have a business case for going and achieving those attestations and certifications because they're not inexpensive, and sometimes they're actually required in order to win a contract or to maintain a business relationship. So they're important, but a lot of companies underinvest in this capability. They settle for checkbox compliance, and they don't see this as a strategic advantage. The A&D company that I was a CISO at, we used our certifications to win more business because our competitors weren't perceived to be trustworthy with secrets. And that's not because they were bad people. It's because they didn't realize you could win deals just based on having more external certifications and attestations about how safe and secure we were when you compared us with other companies. Well, at the traditional level, external attestations and certifications, those are pretty informal, pretty unstructured, and there's not defined procedures to go get them or to maintain them. Organizations at the initial level, they've got some documented processes for managing their external attestations and certifications, and those are implemented across projects and across departments, but not as a business-wide or an organizational-wide capability. Organizations at the advanced level, they've got well-defined, tailored processes for going and getting those external attestations and certifications, and there's a high degree of standardization across the organization. And the optimal level, that's where we start to see continuous improvement and organization-wide integration of those attestation and certification practices. Now, ensuring compliance with contractual requirements, that's crucial for maintaining your trust and your legal obligation and resolving your disputes through varied activities and evolving your practices from traditional to optimal levels. Contract compliance, I mean, it might sound boring, but ultimately it involves activities like auditing and training and building out controls so you can adhere to your agreements, which is really crucial for organizational consistency and reputational enhancement. And this is another area that I find that companies traditionally underinvest in at first, where it's more important for them to win a deal and then to understand all of the terms and conditions in a given contract. But then you learn as a company grows that if you can standardize contractual terms, that actually accelerates your deals and can also transfer your risks. But traditional contract management, that's informal, it's reactive, and it's heavily reliant on having the right person, specific individual, which ultimately increases our risks by introducing inconsistent practices. The initial level introduces specific documented processes, as well as some basic monitoring of our contracts and some level of employee training, which really helps to enhance our consistency and our accountability in our contract management processes. Advanced contract management, that has standardized practices across the organization. There's the use of sophisticated controls, and there's a focus on data-driven continuous improvement that's aligned with a company's strategic objectives. Optimal practices, they really integrate contract management throughout the organization. They use adaptive processes, and it's aligned with this business strategy, but there's also full employee engagement, and you finally start to see like innovative technology use in that space. Similarly, compliance with legal requirements. This is different than contractual requirements. That involves proactive management, technology integration, and also a cultural commitment to mitigate your risks and enhance operational efficiency. And again, even though I might sound like an attorney at times, I haven't passed the bar. I can say with confidence that if you don't know about a law, that doesn't make your organization magically immune from some given law. But this is one of those instances where companies that they don't want to have internal counsel at first until they've grown to a certain level. And that poses what are effectively hidden risks to the organizations. And that just doesn't include existing laws, but also emerging laws, which is why I always recommend like CISOs, go make good friends with counsel, like go have a coffee with them on a regular basis so that you're not surprised by the emergence of new laws. At the traditional level, organizations are reactive. They respond to their legal requirements as they emerge. And there's a limited understanding of the full range of applicable legal requirements, which leads to potential non-compliance risks. At the initial level, the approach to compliance is more structured than traditional with some internal responsibility for legal compliance. At the advanced level, compliance is integrated into business operations and there's regular and comprehensive training and effective communication. This is where you see people with a job title like Chief Compliance Officer or Chief Legal Officer. And organizations at the optimal level, they manage their global compliance effectively, but they also have agility and change management, and they engage their stakeholders transparently. Now, as organizations grow, they move from ad hoc approaches to integrated strategic management of their regulatory relationships, which really enhances compliance and collaboration. For some of you, this might come as a surprise, but that whole like public comment period associated with a draft law or regulation, that's where this kicks off, where some regulatory body is going to make a proposal for a rule. And the companies that are good at managing relationships, they already know that's coming. And they'll submit comments. And in some cases, they'll work with their industry partners to submit similar comments. And that's before we even get to the companies that have got lobbyists who try to get ahead of regulatory changes, or they influence the direction of those changes. So they're either favorable to their organization or sort of that they're watered down changes that are less onerous. And I think we're going to see more of this in the coming years in response to the Loper-Bright decision, particularly for the SEC, but also the DoD's CMMC efforts. Organizations can get good at this, but at the traditional level, it's ad hoc, it's reactive, and there's limited regulatory understanding, which it results in potential compliance issues and also a reliance on individual expertise and know-how. The individual level, at the initial level, I should say, there's basic processes and some designated responsibilities. You have some regularity in communication and the beginning of proactive compliance elements. When we get to the advanced level, organizations standardize their processes. They proactively engage with their regulators, and they also employ data-driven management with extensive regulatory knowledge. I've worked with more than a few financial and biotech companies that are at the advanced and optimal levels, where they realize the business value of engaging proactively with their market regulators. And the optimal level, that means you've got continuous improvement, a strategic and integration with your business objectives. You've got innovative engagement with the regulators, and there's the extensive use of technology and regulatory relationships. Now, effective compliance and monitoring, is that the right slide? That is the right slide. Cool. Effective compliance and monitoring and auditing really moves from informational reactive processes to an integrated strategic process that enhances our legal adherence and operational efficiency. Brief story here towards the end. I told a few people I was writing a GRC maturity model. They thought this is what I was working on, because as a CISO, monitoring and auditing can be painful and time consuming for cybersecurity teams. But I hope, as you're seeing here, there's more to the GRC than just passing an audit. That's the check the box mentality that treats GRC just as some problem to be solved, where just the right piece of software magically fixes it. And so we've got a whole cottage industry of vendors saying they'll fix GRC, where all they meant was that reporting might suck less and be less time consuming. It's a fiction, and it ignores all the other contributions required to do GRC at an optimal, mature level. But the traditional levels of compliance monitoring and auditing, it's ad hoc. There are informal processes that have got minimal technology support, and that leads to inconsistent and reactive compliance management. When we get to documented procedures, regular scheduling, and the introduction of basic digital tools, that helps mark the transition to a more structured approach. So you get some consistency across departments. And if you've ever used like Excel to try and get your SOC 2 or your ISO, you know what the initial level is like, particularly when you add a second framework or a third framework, right? It gets hard. Advanced levels, you start to see organization-wide standardization and sophisticated monitoring. You also see centralized control mechanisms and comprehensive training that's aligned with your strategic business goals. And optimal compliance monitoring and auditing involves continuous improvement, full organizational integration, strategic alignment, and innovative digital technology transformation. Moving to compliance remediation, that's the The point of that is to correct practices that don't meet regulatory or policy standards and to improve our legal alignment and our operational efficiency. Remediation involves corrective actions, sometimes policy adjustments, sometimes employee training, but also you need to have monitoring to make sure you are compliant and operating efficiently. Traditional approaches, they're reactive, they rely on individual efforts, and they don't have a lot of structure behind them, which means you've got inconsistent compliance management. The initial level introduces basic documented processes and assigned responsibilities, but it's still pretty reactive with room for improvement. Advanced levels, you start to see proactive strategies. You start to see standardized processes across departments with advanced data management and stakeholder engagement. And finally, when we get to the optimal level, the remediation is dynamic and it's integrated, and there's focus on continuous improvement and innovation and alignment with a company's strategic goals. So let's move to our final section, which is about bringing all of governance, risk, and compliance together as efficiently as feasible. This is the underpinning. So compliance operations moves from manual, inefficient processes to advanced automated systems that are aligned with strategic objectives for optimal risk and compliance management. Now, some of you might be looking at these levels and be thinking, that's the sales slide. That's what everybody's trying to sell because it requires technology and it's at the end of the deck, right? I've seen companies scale their GRC programs by hiring a lot of employees and consultants. And if you've got unlimited money, this is a viable way to do this without much technology at all. You could also, in theory, pay developers to write you custom Python code to do everything that's shown on screen here. And I know more than a few CISOs that take that approach. I personally once built this all out in Power BI and Excel, which was just as terrible as it sounds. But the tool doesn't matter. What matters is that it's reliable and it's maintained. When I was doing audit and assessment work, I loved it when a client told me they'd written their own compliance tool because I could charge them twice. First, to audit their tooling to make sure that it produced immutable artifacts, and then a second time for whatever actual audit they wanted. What matters here is the collaboration and the communication across the pillars of G, R, and C so that executives and stakeholders have a unified view of how this business process is running, regardless of tools, because we don't have a tools problem in GRC. Traditional compliance levels in the space, there are a lot of manual processes and there's some basic digital tool adoption, but that leads to inefficiencies and potential errors. Improving involves integrating technology, but also having standardized metrics, which helps to increase efficiency and transparency in compliance management. Advanced features, they have advanced levels feature sophisticated analytics, automation, and as well as a unified GRC framework, which really allows for some agile and informed decision making. And finally, at the optimal level, compliance processes are continuously improved with predictive analytics and real-time monitoring, which is built into an organization's strategic planning. And that, friends, is the overview based on what is now a 100+ page maturity model that like I said, I wrote over a lot of cups of coffee in months, and it was reviewed over by some of the smartest people in the industry. There's a lot more to this too. In 2 weeks, we'll have 4 of my favorite smart people on a live stream talking about how to apply the model to your organization. And at the end of August, we'll be presenting on how organizations can conduct a self-assessment of their maturity level. But what happens next, that's up to you. If you're interested, download the model. There's a QR code shown there on screen that will just get you straight to a PDF of it, as well as check out our self-assessment questions online. And because for us to get collectively better at GRC, like this is going to take some effort and planning. I'm the steward and the owner of this model, and I plan on being available for questions and comments and feedbacks once organizations have started to deploy the model. Because I knew out of the gate, this was not going to be perfect. I don't actually think there is a perfect version of this model, and I'm going to have to update this at some future date. But that's not a reason for delaying releasing it or trying it out. So that's available now. And with that, we have a couple minutes for questions from the audience, and I see a couple of those. I'm going to take at least 2 of these really quickly. And the first question from the audience was, how should we get started with the model? So first of all, use the QR code to download a copy of the model. And then I think it's a question of looking across all of the processes to start to do a self-assessment of how your organization behaves. And I'd say that, like, to do it effectively at scale, you're going to need to have multiple stakeholders involved, because No one person at an organization is going to know everything that's going on in GRC. So try and get other collaborators and get their perspectives on how an organization is behaving before saying like, hey, we are a traditional level here, we're at an initial level here, and we're at advanced. One other question, just briefly. Do you have an information about the average maturity of companies? Not yet. Eventually, that's something that we're hoping we'll figure out a way of collecting and anonymously sharing, possibly through a survey system. We're not sure yet, because I know that, like, having done executive advisory work on cybersecurity, companies always care that they're in the mushy middle. You don't want to be spending too much. You don't want to be spending too little. You want to be kind of in the middle of the pack of your cohort. And so at Hyperproof, we will be evaluating how we can collect information about the maturity of companies in aggregate and eventually be able to do some initial cohort analysis for folks. With that, though, we've hit an hour. I want to thank the audience for submitting questions. Thanks for staying on. There was a lot of content in today's presentation. With that, I will turn it back to Lori, who will help us wrap up. Or Lori might not be there.
Thank you. I am so
There
sorry.
we go, on mute. That's all right.
Thank you all for attending. As I stated at the beginning of the session, we will be sending an email including a copy of the GRC maturity model to all of our registrants, and this recording will be available on our Bright Talk channel immediately following the end of the session. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.